Vernon Merrick had 9 days left to live, and not one person in Hollis Bend, Georgia was coming to see him. 20 years earlier, this man burned down a family's future, took a father who never made it home, turned a little girl into the kind of woman the whole town still whispers about. And now, in a hospital bed, dying alone, the only hand he had left to hold belonged to Camille Ward, a nurse who never missed a night. What nobody watching knew, not the nurses, not the town, not even Vernon himself, was exactly why she kept coming back. By the time you finish this story, you will understand why a grown woman chose to hold the hand of the man responsible for the worst night of her childhood. You will understand why she never told him who she really was. And you will understand why, on the last night of his life, Vernon Merrick said 4 words to her that changed everything she believed about her own family. This is not a simple story about forgiveness. It is a story about a debt that was quietly being paid for 2 decades without a single person in Hollis Bend ever knowing it. And about a truth that only came out because one woman refused to let a man die without saying what he had been too afraid to say for 20 years. By the time this story ends, you will find yourself asking whether you would have made the same choice she did. I want to be honest with you for a second. I do not know your name, but a story like this only exists because someone like you decided to stay and hear it all the way through. So if it's all right, take a second, subscribe, like, and share this with someone who could use a good story tonight. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your city, your country, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Thank you for staying, because in this story, there's a piece you don't have yet, and it changes everything. Long before she ever held his hand, Camille Ward didn't know his name. Camille Ward grew up above a small grocery store on Larkspur Street, the kind of place where everybody's name was known before they walked through the door. Her father, Elijah Ward, had built that store from nothing, working double shifts at the mill before he could afford to open it. And by the time Camille was born, it was the heart of the block. Neighbors ran tabs there when money was tight. Elijah never turned anyone away. Camille remembers sitting on the counter after school, watching her father hand candy to children whose families couldn't always pay for it, and telling her that a business only mattered if it took care of the people around it. The apartment above the store was small, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and cornbread, but Camille never remembers it feeling small. She remembers her father coming up the back stairs after closing, still smelling like the store, sitting at the table and going through the day's receipts while her mother hummed church hymns over the stove. She remembers Sunday mornings when the whole block seemed to walk past their window on the way to service, and her father waving at every single one of them like he had been waiting all week just to do that. Her mother, Ruth Ward, kept the books and kept the family steady. She was quieter than Elijah, but just as strong, the kind of woman who could hold an entire household together with nothing but discipline and love. Ruth had grown up 2 streets over, the daughter of a seamstress, and she brought that same careful, exact way of doing things into the marriage. She balanced the store's ledger every night at the kitchen table, and she taught Camille to count change before she taught her to ride a bike, because she believed a woman who understood money could never be taken advantage of. Camille didn't understand yet how much that lesson would matter. Camille was 8 years old, and by every account she remembers, that year had been a good one. The store was doing well enough that her parents had started talking, quietly at first, about the empty lot next door. Elijah wanted to expand, maybe add a small deli counter, something Ruth had been asking for since before Camille was born. They had even started setting money aside in an old iron safe bolted into the floor of the back office. Cash Elijah didn't trust to any bank after watching his own father lose everything in one during the years before Camille was born. There was nothing in that autumn that suggested anything was about to go wrong, which is exactly why what happened next still does not sit right with anyone who lived through it. A man had been coming around the store that fall, a contractor named Vernon Merrick, hired to fix some old wiring in the storage room that had been sparking on and off for months. Camille remembers him only vaguely from that time, a quiet man in work boots who tipped his hat to her mother and never stayed longer than the job required. Nobody on Larkspur Street thought twice about him. He did good work, he charged fair prices, and in a town where everybody's business eventually became everybody else's business, Vernon Merrick was, for a little while longer, simply a man doing his job. The fire started just after midnight on a Tuesday in October. Camille was asleep in the back bedroom when the smoke alarm went off, and her first memory of that night is her mother's hands, cold and shaking, pulling her out of bed before she was even fully awake. By the time they reached the street, the smell had already changed from smoke to something heavier, something that stayed in Camille's memory long after the doctors told her it was only her imagination filling in details a child that age shouldn't have been able to process. Neighbors stood on the sidewalk in their bathrobes, watching flames climb through the roof Elijah Ward had repaired with his own hands 2 summers earlier. Someone was screaming for the fire department to hurry, though the trucks were already turning onto Larkspur from 2 blocks away. Camille remembers her mother counting heads in the crowd, over and over, the same 3 names, and not finding the 4th one anywhere among them. Vernon Merrick had gone into the building twice before firefighters ever reached the door. On his first trip in, he pulled 3 people to safety with his own hands. On his second, trying to reach the back office, the smoke overtook him, and arriving firefighters found him collapsed near the doorway, his hands burned badly enough that he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. Elijah was not one of the 3. Witnesses said he had gone back inside after everyone else was already out, and no one ever fully understood why, only that he never came back through that door. Camille was told, years later, that he had gone back for the old iron safe, the one that held the family's entire savings and the deed to the building, the one he never trusted to a bank. Whether he believed he had time, or simply couldn't stand the thought of losing everything he had built twice in one lifetime, nobody left alive could say for certain. The fire took the back office, the safe, and Elijah Ward, all within the same 20 minutes. The man pulled from the wreckage with burns on his hands, the man everyone in Hollis Bend would spend the next 2 decades blaming, was Vernon Merrick. Investigators ruled the fire had started from faulty wiring in the storage room, wiring Vernon had installed months earlier, wiring the insurance company's own inspector later argued had been rushed and improperly grounded. Vernon never stood trial, but he never needed to. In a town like Hollis Bend, judgment does not require a courtroom. Within a year, his contracting business was gone, work drying up as word spread through every job site in the county. His wife left within 18 months, taking their 2 children with her to Savannah, and Vernon Merrick had become the man nobody spoke to, the name mothers used to warn their children about cutting corners. Ruth Ward never fully recovered. She kept the family afloat on cleaning jobs and the goodwill of neighbors who remembered Elijah, taking on other people's laundry and other people's kitchens while trying to hold together what was left of her own. Something in her had gone quiet the night the store burned, a kind of quiet that never fully lifted no matter how many good days followed. Camille grew up fast, raised largely by her mother's old friend, a church deacon named Walter Price, who filled in where he could, driving Camille to school when Ruth's shifts ran long, sitting with her through homework, but never pretending to replace what was lost. What Camille did not know as a child, what she would not learn until she was a grown woman working nights in an ICU 30 miles from Hollis Bend, was that every few months for almost 18 years, an envelope with no return address had shown up in her mother's mailbox. Never a note inside, only cash, always in amounts too specific to be random, always arriving right around the time the utility bills came due. Ruth never told her what was inside those envelopes. She never told anyone, not even Deacon Price, who noticed them once and asked, and was told only that it was nobody's business but hers. Ruth Ward passed away when Camille was 26, and the envelopes stopped coming the same year. Camille recognized the name the moment it appeared on the admission chart, 20 years and 30 miles removed from Larkspur Street. Vernon Merrick, 80 years old, congestive heart failure, no listed next of kin, no emergency contact. For a week she told herself she would request a transfer, hand his care to another nurse, and never think about it again. She had built an entire life outside Hollis Bend specifically to avoid moments like this one. Instead, she found herself standing outside his room on her 3rd night, unable to walk away from the sight of a dying man with nobody in the chair beside him. She told herself she was only doing her job. She kept telling herself that for months, long after it had clearly become something else. At first, Vernon barely spoke. His voice was thin, his breathing shallow, and most nights he simply slept while Camille worked around him, checking his vitals, adjusting his medication, doing the quiet, ordinary work of keeping a dying man comfortable. She never told him who she was. On the admission paperwork, her last name was buried under a middle initial and a maiden name she used professionally, a small coincidence that let her stay anonymous in a room she had every reason to hate. She told herself she was watching him the way she might watch anyone, out of professional habit. She knew that wasn't true. She was watching him for a confession she didn't yet know she was waiting for. There were nights he was more alert, and on one of them, half asleep, he said something that did not match the story Camille had carried her entire life. He mentioned a name she did not recognize, a man named Walter Kessler, and said the words, "He told me it would just look like a break-in." Camille did not sleep that night. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot until sunrise, running the sentence over in her head, trying to make it fit into a story that had never once, in 20 years, included another name besides Vernon Merrick's. The next morning, on her day off, she drove back to Hollis Bend for the first time in 3 years and pulled every newspaper clipping from that October at the county library, searching for a name she had never once heard connected to the fire that took her father. The librarian, an older woman who remembered the Ward family, watched her work through the microfilm without asking questions, the way people in small towns sometimes know exactly which questions are not theirs to ask. What she found unsettled her more than she expected. The original insurance report on the building had been finalized in less than 2 weeks, unusually fast for a fire involving a fatality, faster than any other claim filed in the county that entire year. The property itself, the empty lot beside the store that Elijah had been hoping to buy, had been sold within a year of the fire to a development company owned by a young, ambitious businessman named Walter Kessler, a name that now sat at the top of half the redevelopment projects in the county, his face on billboards advertising a new shopping corridor going up 2 blocks from where the store used to stand. Camille began quietly gathering everything she could find: permit filings, old zoning board minutes, a single photograph of a much younger Walter Kessler standing outside the empty lot 8 months before the fire, shaking hands with a city councilman who had since retired. She drove out to see Deacon Price, now in his 80s, still sharp, still living in the same house 2 streets from where the store once stood. He remembered the name Kessler. He remembered, too, that the original fire marshal on the case had left the department less than a year later and moved out of state, something that had never sat right with him, though he'd had no proof of anything. Only the quiet unease of a man who had watched his community close a case too fast. If you are still with me, thank you. Drop a comment and let me know what you would have done in Camille's place. Before she confronted Vernon with what she knew, Camille did one more thing she never told him about. While she was already at the county records office pulling permits and zoning minutes, she found herself searching a second name almost without deciding to, and came up with an old custody filing from Vernon's divorce, along with an address in Savannah for his daughter. Using that address, she called the woman, Denise, Vernon's only daughter, now in her 40s. Camille never identified herself as Elijah Ward's daughter, only as a nurse caring for a patient with no listed next of kin. Denise's voice on the phone was flat, unsurprised, almost rehearsed, as if she had imagined this call arriving for 20 years and had long since decided what she would say when it did. She told Camille that her father had stopped being her father the day he let his family fall apart rather than tell the truth about why, and that whatever was left of him now belonged to whoever was foolish enough to still be sitting in that room. She hung up before Camille could say anything else. Vernon's son, Michael, never returned the message Camille left at all. Camille sat with that phone call for days, turning it over, comparing it against her own choice to keep showing up for a man who had every reason to expect nothing from her. She didn't tell Vernon about the call. She wasn't sure yet whether she was protecting him from more pain or protecting herself from having to explain why she'd made it in the first place. What she did know, sitting in her car outside the hospital afterward, was that somewhere between Larkspur Street and this parking lot, she had become the only person left willing to do for Vernon Merrick what his own children no longer could. Camille went back to the hospital 3 nights later with a folder she had no intention of showing Vernon, only a question she could no longer avoid asking. She sat down in the chair beside his bed and, for the first time in months, told him her full name. Vernon Merrick went still. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that Camille wondered if his mind had finally started slipping the way the doctors warned her it might. Then he said, quietly, that he had wondered for months whether she knew, and that he had prayed every night she wouldn't. because he didn't think he had the strength left to say out loud what he had been carrying for 20 years. It took 3 more nights before Vernon said enough for Camille to understand what had actually happened that October. Walter Kessler had paid him to stage a break-in at the store, damage that would look like vandalism and justify an insurance claim large enough to force Elijah into selling the building at a loss, clearing the lot for the development Kessler had already been quietly planning with the county. Vernon needed the money badly that year, behind on payments for his own young family, and told himself no one would get hurt. He rewired a junction box to make it look like faulty work, planning to report it himself and collect a smaller repair contract once the claim went through, never intending for anything to actually catch. When the fire caught faster than he expected, spreading through old dry lumber in the storage room before he even smelled the smoke, he pulled 3 people out with his own hands, his palms already blistering from the heat, and went back a second time, trying to reach the back office where he knew Elijah had gone, until the smoke finally drove him back outside for good. He told Camille he had stood on that sidewalk and watched the roof come down knowing exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost, and that no punishment the town gave him afterward ever came close to matching what he gave himself every single day since. He never told anyone the truth because Kessler made it clear, quietly, through people who never had to say much to be understood, what would happen to Vernon's own wife and children if he did. By the time that threat no longer mattered, his marriage already gone, his children already grown up somewhere else with a different last name, Vernon had decided he deserved every bit of what Hollis Bend gave him, and more. The envelopes that arrived at Ruth Ward's mailbox for 18 years, money Vernon earned doing repair work under a different name 2 counties over, were the only apology he ever knew how to give. He never signed them. He never expected forgiveness. He only wanted Ruth and her daughter to have what little he could send, for as long as he was able to send it, without ever having to face them and explain why. Walter Kessler did not disappear after that October. He built an entire career on land deals across the county, and 20 years later, his name was attached to a new proposal to redevelop the very block where the Ward family store once stood, a project already moving through the county planning board with almost no opposition. Camille sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks, torn between the quiet, private ending Vernon seemed to want and the public truth her father never got to have. She thought about her mother, receiving envelopes for 18 years and never once asking who they were from, and wondered whether Ruth had known more than she ever let on, or simply decided some peace wasn't worth disturbing. 9 days before that final night, a doctor had pulled Camille aside in the hallway to tell her Vernon's heart was failing faster than they'd expected, and that 9 days was likely all that was left. That was the same 9 days this story opened with. In the end, Camille chose the truth. On what would turn out to be his last night, she asked Vernon if he would be willing to say everything again, this time recorded, this time with his permission to use it however she saw fit. His voice was barely above a whisper by then, his breathing labored, but he answered without hesitation, telling her it was the only thing left he could still give her family after everything he had taken. Vernon Merrick died the following morning with Camille holding his hand, the same chair beside his bed that had sat empty for so many years finally, permanently, occupied by someone who chose to stay until the end. Camille brought the recording to a reporter who had once covered redevelopment deals in the county and had crossed paths with Kessler's name more than once over the years. Within a month, the story of what really happened on Larkspur Street 20 years earlier was public, corroborated by the same old zoning filings and permit records Camille had pulled from the library months before. Walter Kessler's current project was quietly shelved while questions were raised about his history, and county officials opened a review into the original investigation, including the fire marshal who had left the state so abruptly all those years ago. For the first time since she was 8 years old, Camille Ward heard her father's name spoken in Hollis Bend without blame attached to it. Vernon Merrick was buried without a single mourner beside Camille, who stood at his grave anyway, understanding by then that the man she had been taught to hate had spent every year since that fire trying, in the only way he knew how, to make something right that could never fully be repaired. She placed a single stone on the headstone before she left, a small tradition she had read about once and never expected to find herself performing for a man who had once been the reason her family fell apart. Walking back to her car, she found herself thinking not about forgiveness, which she still wasn't sure she had fully given him, but about the 20 years of silence he had chosen to carry so that she and her mother never had to carry the whole truth alone. 3 weeks after the story broke, Denise called her back. She had read the article twice, she said, still not entirely sure why she needed to hear the details from Camille directly instead of from a newspaper. She asked whether he had suffered. She asked whether he had said anything about her. Camille told her the truth, that he had spoken about his children more than once, always with the same quiet certainty that reaching out would only hurt them further, never once asking Camille to pass along a message he didn't believe he had the right to send. Denise was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. She never said whether she forgave him. She only asked, before hanging up, if someone could tell her exactly where he was buried. If Camille Ward's story reached you the way it reached me, I would love to know. Tell me down in the comments. And if you have not already, please subscribe. Thank you for watching.